IGC 101, Unit 1. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. So the next slide here has my bio. So I'm not going to read it out. I'm just going to tell you in a few words my background. I've been working in translation and interpreting since 1981. So I'm a bit of a dinosaur in the field. I started off as a translator. My mother was a translator, so it ran in the family. And after working as a translator for several years, I sort of fell into interpreting. I started off with medical interpreting, never really left it, but added on legal interpreting and conference interpreting, and later decided to come back to interpreting as an instructor. So I got my Master's of Education in adult teaching, and I got my PhD in human sciences, but with a 5-year study on the cultural work of medical interpreters. So as an instructor, I've worked at Boston University, I've taught at Cambridge University and Osaka University. I've also taught in other interpreting training programs. I have been an advocate for interpreters for many years, and as such, I volunteered as in many capacities in the International Medical Interpreters Association, also known as IMIA, to which I ended up working as president and later as executive director. And at that time, back in 2009, we co-founded the National Board of Certification for Medical Interpreters, which now is, the national body that certifies the most interpreters. I've been working mostly as a consultant now, helping training programs with curriculum design and health organizations in improving their interpreter department services. And I continue to do research on certain aspects, specifically on interpreter competencies and certification, the simultaneous mode in healthcare, and intercultural mediation. So I had the opportunity to publish my first book, Intercultural Mediation in Healthcare. I just co-edited a 500 research compendium, and this one is really the latest research from international researchers on the topic of medical interpreting. And I'm working now on my next book on intercultural communication. And something I've been enjoying the most is really helping with interpreter onboarding as a career coach and mentor to empower new professionals coming into the field. So let's get on with the topic at hand. We're going to start off with 3 very important standard policies in interpreting. The first one is preparation, and that goes for any profession. But in interpreting, we're often in so many different situations, and without that preparation, we really can run into the feeling of not knowing what's going on. So obtaining pertinent background information from the parties before starting an interpretation, if you're face-to-face, before entering the room, or if you're a remote interpreter before starting a session, it's incredibly important that you at least know what's going on. Is this a follow-up appointment? Is this a serious situation? Is there any history? And oftentimes providers will volunteer that as they meet you. That's the first thing they say, but I'm seeing a patient, and then they go on and explain something. Even asking the provider, is there anything I should know about this session, or what's your goal for the session? It helps the provider to see that you're really interested in being there as part of the team, helping everything go well. Even with the patient as well, getting their name and just hearing them speak for a minute can give you a lot of information about what kind of language issues you're going to be facing. So keep in mind that preparation is important, and it shows, and the lack thereof also shows. The second policy we're going to talk about is keeping in mind that everything communicated must be interpreted. And why is that? That's because in in our work, we're often the only person who speaks two languages and is privy to everything that is being communicated. Oftentimes, the parties have to listen to, speech or signing they don't understand, and they don't know what's being discussed. So this is called the principle of transparency. And when we're going to say something to a party, we alert the other party, I need to ask for a clarification, and then you go ahead and speak in the other language. That way, the party that's left out knows what's going on, doesn't feel left out. But when we don't do that, people can be felt left out, and then trust goes down. And we need the trust of our clients and consumers, patient and provider, at all times to really foster that strong professional relationship. So transparency is very important, and these are things we will discuss with the clients as well. The third one is keeping all information confidential. In the US in particular, we have a specific law, the Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, called HIPAA, and well known as HIPAA, and it basically forbids us from sharing patient information or any identifying information. And that's related to the patient's right for privacy. So let's go on and talk a little bit about moving on to protocols. So the first thing we ever do when we're going to start an interpreting assignment, a session, we have to introduce ourselves to the provider and patient by name and language. It's important that all parties know who we are and what we're there for. And because so many people haven't worked with interpreters, or at least with professional interpreters, we have to introduce how to work with interpreting as well, and sort of set the stage for how this will go smoothly. So the first thing we do, obviously, is we confirm that everything that is communicated in the room will remain confidential. We establish that. We request that the provider and the patient address each other directly and not to us as the interpreter. And what do I mean by directly? Directly meaning that, and you would say this, I want you to speak to each other or communicate with each other as if I'm not here. So instead of saying, I want you to tell her to take her meds, just tell her to take her meds. And sometimes people don't know what you mean until you give an example. Also, when we talk about communicating directly, what we mean is that we're using the first person. So instead of tell the person, it's you and I. That's the first person type of communication. So we attempt to position ourselves in a way that really maximizes the eye contact between the parties. Otherwise, they'll all be looking to you, and you'll be looking to them, and they'll never be looking at each other. And that's an issue because we want them to have that relationship, which I'll speak about later. So typically we'll position ourselves behind the patient or provider, a little bit to the side, a little bit behind, which kind of forces them to look ahead, and they're not going to be looking back at us. And we might even tell them why we're doing that. It all depends on the spacing in the room. If you're a remote interpreter, don't think you don't have to position yourself. If you're an audio interpreter on phone interpreting, you might have to ask the parties to move closer to the phone, or maybe it's a polycom, or maybe it's a speakerphone. You might have to ask them to use the handset because you can't hear very well. So positioning also may mean asking the other parties to position themselves. If it's video interpreting, you might need to ask them to move the screen a little bit to the side so you can see the patient clearly. Maybe you're a sign language interpreter and the patient's going to be signing. You need to see them very well. And if they move around, you may have to ask that to be moved around. So positioning is something the interpreter really needs to think through. And you learn this with experience. And once you position yourself in the best place, you'll be able to really hear all the parties, see the parties, and interpret in the best way possible. We have to always remember that everything we're doing is really to honor the voice of the parties there. And in order to do that, we need to, make sure we set the stage right. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about a few other procedures. We want to keep a comfortable pace of interpretation. You don't go too fast or too slow because it might affect understanding. You also need to interject as necessary for accurate communication or interpretation purposes only. And what I mean is that, we're not interjecting to get involved in the conversation, but we're interjecting because maybe we couldn't hear something, we need to ask for a repetition, or we didn't understand something and we need to ask for a clarification. We can't interpret what we don't understand. So when we do interject, and it's different from, interjecting is a necessary tool that we use. We actually use the third person. So this may sound a little strange, but typically we'll say the interpreter needs to ask the patient to repeat what he just said. By using the third person, we're alerting the parties that we're not interpreting for the other party that's speaking or signing, but we're actually speaking for ourselves. So it might look strange at first, but you'll notice that it really is, if everybody's speaking in the first person, then the interpreter is the one that speaks in the third person. So we ask occasionally if the patient has any questions, and that's a good way to allow the patient to speak if they're not understanding something. We're there to facilitate communication, and communication doesn't happen unless there's comprehension. So we may even need to ask the provider or the patient to use a diagram or a picture to explain what they're talking about, because not everything can be expressed verbally or in signs. So seeking understanding is very important, and we have to realize that as interpreters, we may have to aid the parties in explaining themselves. So as the interpreter, you may be aware of cultural differences that may need to be inquired or addressed for optimal communication, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But these are just some of the things that you need to keep in mind, that when we're interpreting communication, we have to make sure that everybody is understanding each other in every way. So let's move on to the next slide here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics. The interpreter cannot interfere, advise, or provide personal or medical opinions. This is incredibly important, and it has to do with us understanding our scope of work. We're not there as personal friends, so that's why we don't give personal opinions. We leave them at the door. We're not there to advise because the party who's there to give medical advice is the provider. And, that's very important. And if we were to do any of these things, we wouldn't be intervening. We would be interfering, which is the opposite of what we want to do. We want to enable the communication. We also have an obligation to provide accurate interpretation and request as many clarifications as required to make that possible. And what I mean by this is a lot of interpreters are afraid to request a clarification or a repetition. They want to look good and they want to make the flow seem completely flawless. Each party communicates, you interpret, and then the other party responds, you interpret, and so forth. Unfortunately, that's, very beautiful, but you can have a full session with no interjection and then have the parties not quite understand each other. So accuracy is paramount, and we'll explain the reasons why more, but we definitely need to ensure that we're interpreting clearly. And if somebody says you and you don't know if they're referring to one or two people, you have to ask so you can interpret it correctly. The interpreter cannot sign a document as a witness. Oftentimes we're asked to sight translate, which is when we read a document in one language and then we start interpreting it in the other as we're reading, sort of simultaneously. Usually these forms only have a location for the patient and for the witness. So oftentimes the provider asks us to sign as a witness, but we're not a witness, we're an interpreter. So you definitely can write just write on the sheet of paper, interpret or put a line and sign. But don't get confused with your role. Our role is to interpret, and I would even put the language under your name, and make sure that when you do sign that you actually cite translated the document you're signing. If you interpreted a conversation about the document, then you should jot a note saying interpreted conversation about this document. Otherwise, it will be understood through your signature that you cite translated everything that was written in the document. So these are the kind of things that we have to think about in order to uphold the highest standards of ethics. We also are not allowed to carry out duties of medical professionals. Not at all. And however minor, and I'll give you an example. You're a face-to-face interpreter, you're in a room with an inpatient, you're interpreting for the nurse and the patient, but the nurse has to step out for a second, and she says, I'm going to be right back. And as she steps out, the patient asks you to give her a glass of water. And you think, well, that's nothing, I want to be nice, and you go get a glass of water and give it to the patient. As the patient gets that glass of water, the nurse walks in and says, oh, no, you can't drink any water. Why did you give the patient water? She's going to have surgery in a few hours, and she just cannot drink any water. So even something as simple as giving a patient a glass of water is really not in our scope of service. And not because, we don't want to help others around us, but because we don't know all the context of the medical condition of the patient. So whenever we're asked to do any duty that's not related to interpreting and that really sounds like something that a provider should do, like even taking a history of a patient, we need to just explain, as an interpreter that's outside my scope of service, as soon as the nurse comes in, we can proceed. So let's move on to a couple more ethical issues. The interpreter's role is not to judge, but to understand the patient's decision. This happens a lot with situations where we disagree with perhaps a procedure a patient's undertaking or discussing, and it can be difficult for those interpreters that don't agree with the situation at hand. But we have to remember, we left our personal selves way back there. We're here in the session as a professional, and as professionals we're there to enable communication. And by participating in that communication, that doesn't mean that we're enabling the action. We're enabling the communication about a certain procedure that we may or may not agree with. And often that comes up in related to discussions of abortion. But we don't know what the final outcome will be, and that's none of our business either. So we have to keep that in mind as an important ethical rule to follow. And, technical advancements are pushing these ethical boundaries, reproductive rights, artificial insemination, amniocentesis, in vitro fertilization, surrogate motherhood, and it goes on and on. And again, as interpreters, we learn as we interpret these situations, but, what we think about them is quite irrelevant in that scenario, in the work environment. Now, each facility has developed pertinent protocols for such circumstances, and we should follow the protocols of whatever facility we're working with. End-of-life issues, the importance of ADRs, advanced directives, and healthcare power of attorney. These are all sensitive discussions we may have with patients that might have never heard of these things and might wonder, why are we even discussing them? But again, we're there to provide the communication that is needed for these decisions to be made. And a last very important ethical tenet is that patients deserve the same care and respect as other patients. That's a medical ethical rule that, anyone who works with patients follows. And, whether it's an AIDS, an HIV positive patient, or a transgender patient, or whatever it is, we need to leave our biases at the door. We have to think of how every human being has the right to health, and that's in the UN Charter of Human Rights. And it's very important that we don't show any kind of bias, even in our body language. In a situation that makes us uncomfortable for whatever reason, we really need to maintain a professional demeanor at all times. So let's move on here to a few more issues related to confidentiality. So I said in the beginning that everything that is stated in a room needs to remain confidential, but protecting confidentiality goes a lot beyond this. If you have a list of the patients you're seeing for that day, you do not leave that list or that information unattended. If you take notes, you need to dispose of that information in a very safe way. So shredding or burning, but you don't just crumble it in front of everyone and just throw it in the basket because, or at least you ask permission or you give it to the provider, but you have to be careful not to seem nonchalant about patient information, even though most people wouldn't understand your notes anyway. If you happen to, have to enter language access documentation in the patient records and you have access to computers and you got to bring up the names of patients, again, secure your passwords, keep your screens out of view, pay attention to what's coming out of that printer. It's very important. Confidential information should never be given where it can be overheard. So even telephone messages to patients, you'll notice that as you interpret for those, they're very vague and for a reason, because that patient may not want everyone in their household, in his or her household, to know, why they're going to a fertility clinic, for example. So it's important that, and now all healthcare organizations try to, maintain the strictest confidentiality. So when we share any information with a provider, and for some reason we're discussing something with a provider, we cannot do it where others can overhear us. So elevators, hallways, strictly forbidden. And we really can only discuss the patient's information within a briefing with the provider as part of the medical team. That's really the only, sometimes in a post session after the interpreting session, we may need to say something or feel the need to explain something, but outside there is really no need. So the only exceptions to confidentiality are, overarching exceptions, and that is when the patient discusses harming self or harming others. And let's just say that the provider walked out of the room and the patient says something to you and says, "Oh, please don't interpret." Well, first of all, we already stated, hopefully, that we are interpreting everything that is being communicated. And if the patient did say something related to harming self or others, there are reporting laws in most countries that require us to expose that. So typically, as an interpreter, we'll expose it to the provider, and then the provider will take on action from there. But this is something that we need to do, and we can be transparent about it. Because we don't just abandon transparency. We tell the patient, "I'm sorry, but I am obligated by law to disclose this information." And I did state that everything communicated would be interpreted, and you go ahead and you share it. So we're going to leave this lecture here. This is our last slide, and I thank you very much for listening.